Hello everyone, it's uxwbill here once again. It's been a while since I've made a video talking about audio equipment, so I thought I might as well go all out and make a video featuring not just one piece of audio equipment, but 4 pieces of audio equipment, 3 stereo receivers and 1 pair of speakers. So let's get started. Now, I have heard it said in the past that you're supposed to save the best or the most entertaining thing for last. And while this is certainly not the best or most capable stereo receiver of the bunch, it certainly has the most interesting story associated with how I came to have it. So rather than save the best for last, I'm just going to dig in right now and use this to kick everything off. There is quite a story behind this receiver. This is, in case you were unfamiliar with it, the Insignia brand, model number NS-R2001 stereo receiver. Insignia is the house brand of electronics and appliance retailer Best Buy in the United States and other countries. This receiver, like the NS-R2000 that preceded it, was manufactured by Sherwood, and both models, the NS-R2001 and the NS-R2000, are very similar internally to the Sherwood RX-4109. However, it is interesting to note that the NS-R2001 seems to have been cheapened quite a bit. Plus, I don't care for its appearance quite as much. I noticed when looking at these in Best Buy, and what limited time I had to do so before some sales drone came along and asked me what the heck I thought I was doing back there, that it appeared the internals had been lightened considerably compared to the NS-R2000. I also noted that the front control layout was much simpler than that of the NS-R2000, and that is something of a mixed blessing because with the NS-R2000 you could access every function of the receiver from the front panel. That is not true of this, the NS-R2001. You actually need the remote in order to be able to do certain things with this receiver. And now for the story. The keykeeper, my dad, and I were all heading out to take the keykeeper's even bigger green piece of junk to an automotive electrical repair shop so that the starter could be repaired and the charging system examined. We knew the starter wasn't working properly, and we had reason to suspect that some component of the charging system wasn't quite right. Plus, considering that the truck had been the victim of an electrical wizard of some sort, and we weren't sure that we'd found all the hot wiring magic that had been done, we decided it was best to have someone somewhat more qualified look things over and see if there's anything we might have missed. Because even though we got everything to work, you certainly don't want any surprises loitering in the background and waiting to cause trouble. Well, after we left, we all piled into the keykeeper's Mercury Grand Marquis, and we were headed down a side street when I saw this massive pile of trash set out. And as proof that I am my father's son, I asked immediately if we could pull over and have a look at it. The keykeeper kind of groaned and was disagreeable because I'm sure that he knew that between my dad and I, we would both end up filling his car with a potentially large amount of junk. There were old computers set out, but this is what caught my eye, the backside of this receiver. I got out, I examined the computers, I found that they were nothing very spectacular. But I did take this thing with me because if nothing else I wanted to have a good look at the interior, and I didn't honestly think that this thing could work. It had to be thrown out for a reason, right? Well, if you're something of an optimist like myself, you'd certainly hope so. I got this thing home, I plugged it in out in the garage, I turned it on, and to my incredible surprise, it came out of protection and powered up normally. So I took it downstairs, I hooked a DC voltmeter up to the speaker outputs and made sure that it was not potentially putting out a large amount of speaker voice coil frying direct current. Indeed it was not, so the next thing it got was something of a test under load. I hooked it up to the computer up here, fed a 1 kilohertz test tone into it, and hooked up these dummy loads over here. Now, while the internals of this thing seem to have been lightened up considerably from the NS-R2000 and the RX-4109, Best Buy still rates this thing at around 105 watts per channel. My dummy loads, assuming that they're honestly specified, are supposed to be able to withstand 120 watts of power, though no time during which they can stand that is given. I doubt that they can stand it infinitely. Well, I cranked this thing up to about 50 or so out of 62 on the volume dial, and while I don't have an oscilloscope and therefore can't tell you if it was clipping, I do know that after about 2 minutes, both of my dummy loads started smoking. And so I figure that it probably actually is good, or at least close to, for the advertised power output rating. And yes, this thing works absolutely perfectly. Now here's a quick look inside the set for anybody who's interested. You can see that I'm looking at the speaker selection relays, the speaker connection plugs, and the standby power supply section over here. There's the main power transformer. The heatsink has been cut down in size. That's the most notable difference that I see between this and the NS-R2000 or the RX-4109 units that I also have. This seems like a pretty clean and simple, no-nonsense design to me. There's just not a lot of fluff and extraneous componentry on this circuit board. The system microcontroller is actually on the underside of the board here, and what's mounted to the front panel is nothing more than a simple display driver IC. And speaking of the display, of course, if we turn this thing around, it won't take you too long to see when I turn the camera into the appropriate mode here that this display is actually largely unused in this particular model. There's a lot of characters in here that would have use with home theater stuff. There are also some curious characters such as the USB, MP3, and WMA notations, which as far as I know, no Sherwood product actually makes use of. And of course then there is a sensor for the infrared remote control over here. You can see it very clearly with night shot turned on. Unfortunately, I did not get the remote for this receiver. And then over here, in keeping with the modern times where every electronic device must have at least one blue LED, this thing has one blue LED to indicate its current status. Now, it's no secret that I do rather like these Sherwood built and designed amplifiers. I think they're pretty good value for the money, but they're certainly not a party amplifier, and they pale in comparison to some of the really nice vintage amplifiers of the 1970s and the 1980s during the peak of the stereo wars craze between different manufacturers. But if what you want to do is simply listen to some decent music, and you're looking for a receiver with a built-in phono section, this thing is cheap, cheerful, and it can certainly get the job done. You go ahead and turn it on here. You can see it powers up. The last thing I was doing with it was listening to something through the auxiliary 1 input. You can choose the inputs through this wheel here, and I haven't really tested the tuner on this. I would assume that it works. You do get to choose FM stereo. You can also force monophonic reception. AM, of course, is monophonic only, and if you look over here, you'll see that there's a little tiny character lit up in the display. Whoops, come here. Come on and focus. Come on, camcorder. Well, if I'd quit messing it up, it might actually focus someday. I couldn't figure out what that letter H was for until I actually hooked a set of headphones to this receiver. As it turns out, unlike the NS-R2000 and the RX-4109, where you can happily play the headphones with the speakers turned on, this thing mutes the headphones when any of the speakers are turned on. And that makes sense because the little H character goes out when you turn on any of the speakers. And of course the headphones go silent as well. So that's about all there is to say about this thing. Seems like a pretty decent little receiver overall to me, but let's move on to some of the others. Here's the next contestant in my stereo receiver orama video. This is a Harman Kardon HK440 VXI stereo receiver. I saw this at the Goodwill store, and having never heard or owned a piece of Harman Kardon equipment, I decided to invest in it just to see if it really was what I had always heard said about it. I've always heard very good things said about Harman Kardon equipment. Unfortunately, I probably paid a little bit too much at $39.96 for this thing. But I know that at the Goodwill store, they oftentimes price stuff just by the brand that's on it. And I also know that at this particular Goodwill store, I had tried to make offers on things in the past and had simply been shot down. So I didn't even bother. I figured, you know, if I have a job and I'm making some money, I ought to be able to spend that money on something that would interest me for at least a little while. Plus, there's two lights on the front of this thing that say high voltage and high current next to them, and that really caught my interest. As it turns out, though, those lights and their presence on this unit are actually kind of ironic, because this thing is only about a 30 watt per channel into 8 ohms amplifier. Now, in the manual, Harman Kardon does say that it is suitable to drive 4 ohm speakers with this thing, and of course you get a little more power out of the amplifier that way, or you would, were it not for the fact that you need to adjust this thing's power supply in order to compensate for speakers that present a lower impedance or load to the amplifier. Here you can see that there is a slide switch back here that is marked for both 4 and 8 ohm positions. When you turn that on, the voltage going to the final transistors in this thing is reduced, thereby cutting the power output of the final output stage in this thing considerably. So you don't get a whole lot more power out of this thing when you hook up a 4 ohm speaker system to it. However, it can be operated safely that way. In fact, although they say not to do it in the manual, this thing puts its speakers in parallel. So if you were to hook two 4 ohm speaker systems to this thing, it's possible that the load, the impedance they present to the amplifier, could in fact drop down to 2 ohms or even less in some places. And while they say not to do this in the manual, Harman Kardon actually does give a 90 watt per channel power output figure into a 2 ohm load, which is quite interesting. It suggests that they maybe didn't have enough faith in their amplifier design to let the average everyday customer do it, but they either tested it or estimated that it would stay together long enough to do it for testing purposes, or at least come up with some kind of a figure. This is a nice looking receiver. It's got a very classy green front panel display on it for the tuner. I think that there's supposed to be a light bulb over here, but it's burned out. You can see that there is an unused character there for the European half-step FM tuning. There's also a number of entries over here whose purpose is unknown. In particular, there are entries in there that say tracking and active, and I'm not sure what they could have possibly been used for, but it's very clear that they're not used in this set. And again, everything works here. The only thing I have noticed any deficiency with is the phono preamplifier, and I'm not really sure why. It seems that any turntable I have hooked up to this thing has extremely low input. I don't know if there's some kind of an issue with cartridge loading or some kind of a setting that I've overlooked. According to the manual, though, there are no adjustments to be made for the phono preamplifier. Interestingly, this thing does let you select your tape monitor source. You can have a tape monitor loop on this thing, which is very handy and something that the Insignia receiver you just saw does not do. It's possible to hook up 2 tape decks to this thing, copying 1 to 2, and then going over here and selecting a tape 2 setting as well, which you'll notice, and this gives away the age of this receiver to the mid-1990s, the position for digital audio tape on the front panel. All in all, I do like the sound of this receiver. I don't think it's really the most outstanding thing I've ever heard, but this thing does give off a very warm sounding overall tone when I have listened to it. It reminds me the most of my tube type stereo amplifier over here on the shelf, which unfortunately is not working very well right now, as one of the output tubes is red plating and there is bad filter capacitor hum in the power supply, so that amplifier definitely needs my attention at some point. And that's about all I can think of to say about this particular piece. And then there's this thing, the final receiver of the bunch. This is a Sony Gx40ES, and as you can tell from the model number, it belongs to Sony's so-called Elevated Standard series of components. Now, I have a couple of Sony ES, or Elevated Standard components. I have the RX-4109 cassette deck, whose speed I had to set back when I got all those cassette decks during cassette deck season. There is a video that has been uploaded about that. I also have a late 1980s Sony ES series I think it's an STS55, but don't quote me on that or go looking for it because I'm probably wrong, AM/FM component tuner. Now, it was modified and fully aligned sometime in the mid-2000s or so before I came to own it. In particular, the audio output stage on it was modified with Blackgate audio capacitors and a couple of other modifications as well that I never got the complete story on. Although my experience with the ES tape deck has been kind of, well, meh, I think my Technics RSM218 that I also set the speed on is the better machine. The tuner is really an example of how to knock someone's socks off on the FM side. Unfortunately, Sony did not put the same thought into the AM tuner of the time, and so it doesn't have a particularly wide band audio response, and it certainly doesn't do anything like AM stereo. Nor does this receiver. And in fact, I saw this. This was available at the Goodwill store once again. But the price this time around was certainly much more reasonable. Of course, you can't read it at all. At least I can't read it here in the viewfinder. So you'll have to trust me that that says $25.96. In fact, it kind of took the lady at the cash register by surprise. She said, "Wow, that's a really nice receiver. I can't believe they priced it so cheaply." Well, rather than wait for them to come around to their minds, I paid for it, and I got the heck out of there. There were a series of these receivers, 3 different models, a GX 40, 50, and I think a 60. The 60 being the top-end version of the bunch, the 50 being middle of the road, and this, of course, being the minimum model. But even so, this thing's specs are quite nice. This is rated, I believe, at 50 watts per channel into an 8-ohm load. I don't believe that Sony gave ratings for a 4-ohm load, and they certainly didn't give one for a 2-ohm load. But again, there is an adjustment on the back of this receiver to control the power supply and its output to the final transistors if you are using more than one 8-ohm speaker system, because again, this set puts them in parallel when they're both turned on, or if you're using a single 4 to 6-ohm speaker system. Anyway, the power button on this is soft. It just presses lightly, and then moments later the set comes on, and then it comes out of protection. That was the second relay click you heard there. The display on this thing is interesting because although it looks as though it is an alphanumeric type, it in fact has only limited ability to represent characters. However, the tuning portion looks like an exact clone of the standalone Sony tuner I have, with the exception of the fact that the display does not allow you to enter free-range alphabetical and numerical characters like the standalone tuner that I have does when you place a station in memory and wish to give it a label more significant than the frequency to which it is broadcasting. Of course, you can press these buttons over here to change the operating mode of the set. There's CD, tuner, a phono input that I haven't tested. Now, if you press the tape monitor button, a relay clicks inside and the tape monitor loop is activated. And then, of course, there is also a video button that allows you to, well, you could hook up any line level source to it, but they really intended for you probably to hook a VCR up to this thing. This dates from around 1990 or so, and then there is a separate tape button whose function is slightly different from the tape monitor loop, but I'm not totally sure how. I think this thing actually allows you to connect 2 tape decks to it, of course, and then, of course, you get various controls down here to govern the operation of the tuner. The one thing that is really striking about this amplifier that really came as such a huge surprise to me is the fact that, you know, people describe amplifiers as having certain voicings or intonations or sounds to them. Even if you're not deep into audio equipment, you may have noticed that some amplifiers, when paired with certain sets of speakers, really sound rather different to one another as you move amplifiers and speakers around. And as Weasel2HTM and I found out back when he was up here and we were playing Stereo Wars, which there will be a video about someday, I promise, I haven't forgotten, we found that speaker selection really made a huge difference when we were playing with the Sherwood RX-4105 receiver. But what really caught me about this Sony is how transparent it sounded. That's not really the word I'm looking for. It didn't add any coloration to the sound. It was easily the most, for want of a better way to put this, direct amplifier I had ever listened to. There was no warmth to the sound. There was no added bass to the sound. In fact, the sound was really almost kind of bass shy compared to what I was used to. And yet this thing is still a very nice sounding amplifier. Now you can certainly compensate for that and adjust it to your liking by dialing into the tone controls here, but even when I turned these all the way up, you couldn't get deep thumping, pumping bass out of this. Not that you'd really want or need that. I did turn the loudness curve button on once, and I thought the loudness curve on this thing was actually kind of overbearing. Now right here next to the volume knob is a muting button that turns on that LED indicator, and that basically drops the sound level by 20 dB when you turn it on. So you could think of that as a sort of emergency mute, or the police are knocking on the door because the party has gotten a bit loud button, or you have to answer the phone or something like that. And of course, in typical highfalutin fancy audio equipment style, this thing doesn't have a volume control. No, it has an attenuator that doesn't want to be called a volume control, so please don't do that. And of course you can also completely bypass the tone and loudness controls with this button on the front that says Source Direct. Interestingly enough, when you turn on Source Direct, it also defeats the balance control from operating. This thing is very heavy, and it is a beast inside. I've not had the cover off yet, but I'll go ahead and pop it off here in a bit so that you can see it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the back panel. Sony was not cheapskating on this thing, no way. There's two AC outlets that are switched, each of them capable of carrying a 100-watt maximum load. These speaker connections are massive. To give you some idea of their size, here's a screwdriver handle, here's my pointer finger. If I put my pointer finger next to those, that should give you an idea of just how big they really are. Likewise, if I do the same thing with the screwdriver handle, these are not tiny speaker connections, and they really feel very nice and precise when you operate them. And of course they can also accommodate banana plugs, if you use such a thing, to connect your speakers. There is the impedance selector, which is actually a power supply adjustment. It seems to me that either the previous owner didn't know about this and therefore left it at the default, or the previous owner was indeed using speakers that presented a lower impedance load to the amplifier, and they had it set over here to the 4 to 6 ohm setting. Well, I'm only going to be driving one single pair of 8 ohm speakers with this, so I went ahead and turned it over to the 8 to 16 ohm setting. But if you ever find an amplifier like this and you plan to run a different speaker configuration, it pays to look for a switch like that. And here you can see the various inputs and outputs on this thing. There's the tape monitor loop, the video, and just the tape input, and then over here are inputs for phono and CD, a ground connection for the turntable, and then connections for AM and FM antennas, and of course grounding for those antennas as needed. Now before we actually look inside this amplifier and take a tour of its internals, I'd like to point out some of the interesting legends on the front. I'm sure that a lot of this is just marketing talk, but the one phrase that I really like that has shown up on various pieces of Sony equipment before is spontaneous twin drive. I almost can't say that without chuckling because it sounds curious to say the least. But let's have a look at the insides of this thing, and probably the best thing that you could do as you're looking at this is compare and contrast with what you saw inside the Sherwood/Insignia amplifier when I had it apart. Keep in mind that this thing is rated for half the output power per channel that the Sherwood and Insignia is, and yet it's built largely the same way, using many similarly valued components. However, I was not able, and I didn't try very hard because I'd have felt awful if I'd have smoked this amplifier, and the test that I was using is arguably somewhat hard on an amplifier. I would have felt bad if I'd have damaged this thing, so I did not push it near as hard as I pushed the Sherwood, because I would have felt less bad about it since I didn't have any money invested in it and it's really not anything that special. But here you can see some of the power amplifier stuff and the power supply inputs, a couple of relays here on the board that are probably used for source selection, the front panel connections. There's a little tiny motor here that operates the volume control. You can see it actually goes into what looks like a kind of gearbox that also contains the volume potentiometer. This was still made in Japan. You know, Sony in the early 90s was starting to change to producing things in more factories around the world. A lot of their later equipment was made in Malaysia, Indonesia, and today a lot of it's being made in China. But you can see that they definitely were not cheapskating on the design of this amplifier. Of course, they called it elevated standard, and I don't think that was entirely without reason. I think if you bought one of these, not only were you going to pay for it, but you could also expect a certain improvement to the baseline performance as compared to a plain, less, shall we say, privileged set. You can see that there is a metal separation here between the power supply area and the amplifier and preamplifier, tuner, and front panel area. So you can have just a quick look there. This board right here is actually the speaker switching board, and you can see that it has a daughter board linking it to the power supply board down here, and of course there's the little standby transformer and stuff like that, and then the large transformer, of course, is the main power supply. So I'll just get a quick overview of the circuit board here so that you can take a look at it in all of its standard definition glory. And then I'll talk about the last thing, the speakers. And here is one of the speakers now. These, once again, were a Goodwill find, and as you can see, when I picked them up, they were suspiciously cheap at $12.96 for the set. Now that, paired with the fact that the speaker selection at my area Goodwill is usually extremely miserable, consisting of things like 3-watt full-range speakers from Sound Design all-in-one systems to Panasonic thrusters with rotted-out foam surrounds, I really wasn't too enthusiastic about these speakers, and my enthusiasm did not improve when I caught sight of the brand. Now, Gerard is certainly a good brand when it comes to turntables. They made a ton of turntables, and they really knew what they were doing. Some of their turntables were pretty classy stuff. But I never knew of them to be a speaker manufacturer, and my thought was, based on the design of these, the fact that they were made in Taiwan, and they looked to be from the 1980s, the late 1980s, when the turntable craze had by and large passed on and was replaced by CDs, or being replaced by CDs, I wasn't too hopeful that these would be good speakers. But then I picked them up, and the cabinets on these are really nice and really heavy. Unfortunately, the previous owner committed a bit of a sin when they had these speakers. They put 2 eye hooks in there, and then they strung up a U-shaped piece of wire so they could hang these speakers on the wall. Now, I think that these actually go through the cabinet, and that's why I haven't removed them yet, because in order to fix this, I'd have to get some kind of wood filler or something, as leaving these holes open could result in whistling or similar disturbances that don't sound very pleasant when these speakers are playing. These are Gerard model GSS 817 speakers. After I picked up the cabinets on these and realized how heavy they were, I looked at the power handling, and that's not at all shabby. Plus, I'd say it's the truth. These aren't party speakers, but they'll certainly stand up and sing if you want them to. So despite all these signs, I realized that these things were probably very much a bargain at their listed price, and I brought them home right away, where I hooked them up, and I have been very, very pleased with their sound. I have no idea if I can get this grill off of here one-handed, but it looks like I just did. Also looks like I could stand to clean the grill, doesn't it? But if we look at these, they've actually got some pretty decent drivers, and from the looks of things, I think somebody refoamed these, because there's evidence of glue down here around the edge, and unfortunately it looks like that glue has started to separate from the actual driver. But my guess is that somewhere along the line someone actually refoamed these speakers, and then you have a nice little tweeter with a dome cone. I'll go ahead and pop these drivers out of there so you can have a look at them. They're not the fanciest drivers I've ever seen, but they're quite adequate for this particular pair of speakers. And there you can see the woofer driver itself. Note the impressively substantial magnet on the back of this thing. Also note the fairly tight wires. That is a good idea when you're assembling or designing loudspeakers of your own, as anything inside that cabinet that's loose and can rattle around could produce some kind of acoustic disturbance. Likewise, there's also a sealing gasket, though it's a little torn up down here, around the outer edge of the driver, again to try and mitigate any issues with chuffing or whistling noises that could happen if the speaker system really gets to playing. But here's something very curious. If you look at the back of the driver, and this is true of the tweeter as well, there are absolutely no manufacturer markings or codes of any kind on either the magnet or the cone, which is very surprising. So I have no idea who actually manufactured these speakers in Taiwan, but I'm pretty sure it was not actually Gerard Corporation. These speakers are, of course, built around the concept of an acoustic suspension design as opposed to a ported style design. Acoustic suspension meaning that they use the trapped air inside the speaker box as a spring against which the speaker drivers must work. Now, I'm kind of lazy, and so I'm not going to fish the crossover out of there or pull the tweeter, but you can be assured that that tweeter is every bit as well made as the woofer that you just saw. And now for a little demonstration of the Gerard loudspeakers. I'll have to keep this pretty quiet, and unfortunately, because of the fact that you'll be listening to this through your own speakers, and it's already been colored by the Handycam Zone microphone, the YouTube compression process, my video editor's compression process, I can't hope to relay what these speakers really sound like. But if you ever find a set of them and you're in need of a set of speakers, I would definitely recommend not passing them up. And so I'm going to run through a few quick pieces of music here, just in little bits and pieces, hopefully to avoid attracting the attention of the copyright mafia. And again, I've got to keep it fairly quiet because it is nearly 3 o'clock in the morning as I record this. So here we go. Now, if you've gotten through this whole video, there you have the complete story on all 3 of these stereo receivers and the pair of speakers. Thank you for watching, and by all means feel free to leave a comment if you have one.